Welcome. You are listening to KZSC's Voces Críticas. I am your host, Silvana Falcone. Today I have a live phone interview, my first one, with Peter Esmonde. Peter is an organizer and board member of the Prisoners Literature Project, which has been sending free books to prisoners throughout the United States for over 30 years. An all-volunteer nonprofit, the Prisoners Literature Project replies directly to prisoners' book requests. Last year, the group sent over 30,000 books directly to those behind bars. In addition to his work with the Prisoners Literature Project, Peter Esmonde is a documentary filmmaker and teacher. He's here to discuss the educational needs of incarcerated people, the difficulty of getting materials to them, and the history of the Books to Prisoners movement. Welcome, Peter, to KZSC's Voces Críticas.
Thank you so much, Silvana.
The Prisoners Literature Project is based in the East Bay. So why don't you tell us a bit about how the project started?
Well, the project actually got started in San Francisco back in the 80s. It was in the back of a bookstore called Bound Together Books, which is still there on Haight Street. And one of the volunteers working at Bound Together got himself busted and found that there was nothing to read in jail. So he wrote his friends and said, look, send me some books. And his friends kind of jumped through hoops and got some books to him. And then they realized that there was a really huge ongoing need for this. And that's how the whole thing started back in the 80s. Since then, it's grown, then became statewide and regional, and now we send books to prisoners in 49 states.
So how many volunteers are part of the project, and what are volunteers such as yourself doing to sustain this project?
It varies. We don't take attendance. There are about, 22 dozen core volunteers. When we send out an email, it goes to almost 100 people. People come and go. It's an all-volunteer effort, as you mentioned. Nobody's paid, so everybody's doing this on their own dime. Mostly it's donating time, donating effort. Reading the hundreds of letters that come in literally every week, trying to find books, match books for the prisoners' requests and shipping them out. And, on top of that, we're always looking for inexpensive sources of books. For like any other nonprofit, we're looking for sources of money, etc. So it's just an ongoing thing. The books come in, the books go out.
And how did you personally get involved in the Prisoners Literature Project?
Well, I brought books in. I had a lot of books that I was selling. A lot of them were in great shape, but, bookstores didn't want them. And, that seems to be more and more the case these days. So I was at Moe's Books in Berkeley. They said, well, why don't you, try donating them to the Prisoners Literature Project, at which point I said, well, what's that? And so I started dropping off books and then got more and more curious and realized, frankly, what a great organization it was. So I just decided to get more involved in it.
And is PLP networked with other similar prisoner book projects throughout the country?
Yeah, there's a common listserv on Rise Up in which Books to Prisoners organizations, we all discuss ongoing issues. Typically we'll share knowledge about the prisons, their, somewhat arbitrary regulations. If there's a particular prison that seems to have changed regulations, we'll give each other a heads up about it. So there's a kind of very loose network of knowledge share.
My guess is that getting books to prisoners is not just about putting books in the mail and sending them to any prison. I wondered if you could enlighten us a bit about the kinds of regulations and rules that the project has to follow or has to deal with to get these books to prisoners.
Yeah, it's jumping through a lot of hoops. For example, private people, like yourself, if you knew somebody inside, you really couldn't send them a book directly. It would have to either go through a publisher like or a distributor like Amazon or Barnes & Noble. You couldn't just, put a book in a package and send it. Prisons demand that you be an authorized distributor, and at this point, the Prisoners Literature Project is one of those. Every prison in the country has different rules and regulations about the kind of materials they will or won't allow. So what we do is we keep a very active database of the rules and regulations, and those are changing all the time. So we keep in touch not only with other Books to Prisoners organizations, but we try to stay in touch with prisoners, and get a sense of, okay, what's going in, what's not going in, any idea why? It's a little bit of a continual battle because prison authorities, particularly the corrections officers, have the ability to reject any materials if they view it as disruptive to the safe and secure operation of the prison. So, the prison guard, if they've had a bad evening or ticked off at somebody, they can easily reject materials at their discretion. And that can be anything from manga to Machiavelli, from nudity to Nietzsche to whatever they like. If you get along with your CO, you as a prisoner might get materials. If the CO is in a bad mood, you may not get them for a while. They may be confiscated. we may get them sent back to us at the Prisoners Literature Project. So it's a very arbitrary system. And in fact, to call it a system is kind of giving it some credit.
I was going to say, maybe that's a generous read or a generous label to give to them. Do you guys have to renew your authorization then to be able to continue?
Generally, no. Most Books to Prisoners organizations in the country have partnerships with independent bookstores, and we're no exception. We're still partnered with Bound Together Books in San Francisco. My understanding is that some of the organizations that try to go it alone, sometimes are really called to get a reauthorization. And of course, if anything happens to slip through, or if they accuse you of sending contraband or something that you really shouldn't have, they can basically pull you off the list and say, sorry, you're no longer authorized. And that happens to everybody occasionally.
So there's such a subjectivity or an arbitrariness, obviously, to these rules that you're talking about. And I assume this has to be also coupled with this larger issue of censorship. What kinds of censorship issues then are you having to sort of deal with? And I think about the context that we have outside of prison, where you have these very sort of organized conservative forces trying to stop the teaching of ethnic studies, for example, in high school levels. What kinds of censorship battles that projects like yours have to navigate that maybe we don't even realize, in addition to what you've just mentioned?
Yeah, well, the rules and regulations, it depends on the state, it depends on the individual prison. There's really this huge balkanization. So in certain parts of the country, you still have a situation where, say, a prison will reject books that are in a foreign language or a language that they don't understand. We've had books, somebody wanted to learn ancient Greek, somebody wanted to learn Hebrew, and, we sent the books to Florida. They came right back to us. Sorry, this is not allowed. This used to be the case historically with Spanish books. In fact, in Attica, in the 60s and 70s, one of the prisoners' protests was that books that would be sent, and letters that would be sent to prisoners in Spanish, would be rejected, simply because the guards couldn't read the language. So, of course, they viewed it as a threat. Thankfully, at least in California, this doesn't happen so much anymore. Oftentimes what we'll see is that nudity is rejected, and this could be anything. So it's very hard sometimes to get a drawing book through, or a book of exercises, or anything like this. These things get rejected all the time. We had there was a Gabriel Garcia Marquez book that had a nude on the cover, and that just got sent right back to us. Also, you have cases where things like Machiavelli, in the past, where Machiavelli or Nietzsche, just having this book was viewed as evidence of gang activity, and these were just rejected out of hand. Thankfully, that was contested in court and overturned. But again, extremely arbitrary. The rules are changing all the time, and a CO can be very capricious and just chuck the stuff right back at us.
I was going to say, too, that's a real key way to assert power, is to just simply throw a book that a prisoner would want in their possession and just say, not today, and just arbitrarily change the rule for that day.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, PLP has been around for about 30 years, but I wondered if you could provide us with a little bit of a brief history about this movement of books to prisoners.
Yeah, when I started getting involved in this, I got very interested in the history of the Books to Prisoners movement. A lot of it came about in the 70s and early 80s. In some ways, the Prisoners Literature Project here in the Bay Area is very typical. A lot of them were started by anarchist organizations, very much grassroots, and very much about getting educational materials to prisoners. So you had, I think the oldest one I know of that's still going there's one in Quincy, Mass. that's been going since 1972. There are other well-established organizations in Seattle, and Austin, Texas, for example. These were, started as organizations begun by anarchists or sometimes by educators, simply looking to get materials. And everybody started on their own. There was not a lot of networking. It started very much grassroots, and everybody came up with their own workflows and their own ways of dealing with the authorities. And then there's another wave that we're still seeing today, and that is progressive Christians, hoping to get Bibles and devotional literature into prisons. And that's more typical of the American South and the Southeast. Not exclusively, but it's more typical of the South. And, now we're seeing a time when I think, some of the anarchist organizations that have been going it alone for so many years are really beginning to network more and are really beginning to understand that knowledge share is very critical. So I think I hope we're entering a new phase of this.
I hope so, too. You are listening to Peter Esmonde, an organizer and board member of the Prisoners Literature Project, which has been sending free books to prisoners throughout the United States for over 30 years. Every once in a while, Peter, you hear about these reports that educational programs in prisons are getting cut. What would you say to those who support or believe that prisoners don't have a right to an education and that they don't see any problems with these kinds of budget cuts? What would you say to them about the importance and the right that prisoners have to an education?
Well, typically, certainly politically, prisoners tend to be the lowest people on the totem pole. They tend to be America's forgotten citizens. And, it's very, very common for them to have their rights taken away. It's an egregious situation. But cutting educational programs from prisoners doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense from a number of points of view. From a purely pragmatic point of view, various studies have shown, there's a RAND study from 2004, I believe, that recidivism is greatly reduced when there are educational programs in prisons. This makes absolute sense. Look, if a person can learn positive social skills, if they can get themselves educated, possibly learn a trade, we send a lot of trade books to prisoners, then they've got a better shot at reintegrating themselves once they're outside. They've got a better shot at, making new social connections, really finding a way to make a living. So, from a pragmatic point of view, it makes absolute sense. It makes sense financially. It's much less expensive to teach someone a trade than to keep on arresting them, locking them up, putting them through the system, paying for their extended keep. Teach somebody a trade, teach somebody how to get by in society, and you're going to give them a leg up. And of course, purely from a humanistic view, it makes total sense. If you ignore these people, if you ignore, people who are behind bars, you're just wasting lives. And there are so many lives that are already being wasted in this country. To waste more human potential simply doesn't make sense. So that would be my response.
And I know prisoners can send you directly book requests. Could you maybe share with us and share with the listeners what you've heard from incarcerated individuals who have received books from the Prisoners Literature Project?
Oh, boy. Yeah. So at this point, we get upwards of about 250 letters a week from prisoners across the country requesting books, and books of all kinds. I mean, just like your general readership. A lot of people want books on learning a trade. People want to read fiction. They want to read mysteries, thrillers. They, particularly want to read about the history and culture of their people. So we get a lot of requests for books on Latino culture, on African American culture, Native American culture, and by authors from these cultures. And when we can meet those requests, and believe me, we really try, we get a lot of thank you letters. We get thank you letters every week. Actually, we just had a session last night and got a letter. I'm just going to read you a little bit of it from a prisoner in upstate New York. First name is Alejandro. This is Alejandro's thank you letter. First, let me thank you for your service, especially for us in the box, which means solitary confinement. It not only helps me learn and deal with this time, but also makes you feel human again, to be cared about. Thank you, each and every one of you, for all you do. It truly does make a difference. There have been times that books have prevented me from killing myself. It sounds dramatic or stupid, but it's true. Solitary confinement here is not a fun thing. So, in case no one told you, or you don't hear it enough, thank you. What you do is truly important. It does help those of us who choose to want to make a change in our lives. He goes on a bit, but that's the gist of it.
That's incredible. So you get letters like this every week?
Yeah.
And so what Alejandro is really signaling there is the power of the book. And I had talked to you about this at one point about how, for me, books are really magical, because I feel they're so powerful. And for me, holding the book is the key. There's a lot of, younger people who I think like the online and the Kindles and the reading their books. But for me, it's the actual holding of the book and the smelling of the book and flipping through the book. And it sounds like for Alejandro, that literally saved his life.
Yeah, and again, Alejandro is certainly not unique in this. We get letters like this all the time, and we've gotten them for years. I mean, this work makes a big difference. A book to somebody who's incarcerated can be a lifeline. A lot of the people who volunteer with the Books to Prisoners organizations, particularly the Prisoners Literature Project, really hold books in high esteem. I mean, a number of our volunteers, as you might imagine, are students, professors, librarians, actually, teachers, generally book lovers, as well as, social justice activists and, people of all kinds. And I think especially for prisoners, books can represent things, well, obviously, the most obvious one is they represent escape. It's a way of getting out of that cell. It's getting away from confinement, from persecution, from dull routine in prison. I think it's education, obviously learning new skills, a lot of requests for language books. People want to learn new languages, particularly Spanish. People want to learn a trade, carpentry, auto repair, welding. We get these kinds of requests all the time. People requesting blank notebooks so that they can attend a writing class because, again, in some of the commissaries, they're charged for paper and pens. Other things they represent. Books represent connection, obviously, to friends and family. There are programs where parents will actually be able to read books with their kids, on an open line. Or simply, they can write back and forth and share books with their kids. And I don't know, I think for all of us, books represent growth, personal growth, mental, spiritual, and hope. Hope in a future outside the prison. Hope the time when they can learn a trade, when they can be back among their loved ones. Hope to get out of that box, out of that cell, out of the yard. Books mean a lot of things. I wasn't exactly succinct about it, but I think it just bears getting into a little bit.
Well, obviously, incarceration is a physical confinement, but there's the mental confinement, which you've talked about, and books at least allow that confinement to be suspended, even for a moment, even for a little bit. And I think the key word there is hope, right? That books, because they sort of get us out of whatever is bogging us down, there can be this moment of hope for them. And that to me is incredibly powerful. And that's why books to me have power. It's not just words on a paper. There's actually something about what it can release in you that is so, and empower you really, that is so phenomenal about books.
Yes, absolutely. And, and if you read particularly 20th century writers, activists, many of them will talk about the power of books in prison. People from Malcolm X to Angela Davis, Jean Genet, Gandhi, all these people have spoken, Mandela certainly, have spoken about the power that books had for them in prison. And that's something that we at the Prisoners Literature Project are all about giving people power over their own lives, over their own capability, as much as we can.
And you're giving them hope, too. You are listening to Peter Esmonde, an organizer and board member of the Prisoners Literature Project, which has been sending free books to prisoners throughout the United States for over 30 years. Do the books go to a prison library, or they go to the individual prisoners, or both?
Well, our books go directly to the prisoners. Again, the name of our organization is the Prisoners Literature Project. Some of the books to prisoners' outfits will send them to prison libraries. But again, in our organization, we have a number of people who are prison abolitionists, and to send those books to a prison library can be viewed as supporting, or at least somehow being complicit in, the prison industrial complex. So we choose not to do that. We want to send books directly to the prisoners, and we can get them directly to the prisoners. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that when somebody is thrown into the box, when somebody's put in solitary, or the euphemism that's used in California is SHU, which stands for Segregated Housing Unit. When they're in solitary, typically one of the first privileges taken away is any privilege they have to the prison library. So without organizations like this, they're simply not going to get books. They're in solitary. They have no access to the prison library. Unless that package is delivered directly to them, they're not going to see a book. And we do get letters all the time from people in SHU. These may be the only books they receive for months at a time. So this stuff it's absolutely critical.
So we've just got about another minute left. I wondered if you could share how the community can support PLP's work and maybe your website if people want to learn more.
Oh, yeah. Thanks so much, Silvana. The website for the Prisoners Literature Project is simply prisonlit.org, prisonlit.org. The best way to support us is, if you're in the Bay Area, come by and volunteer. We meet twice a week. You'll find the hours on the website. And we just get together. We read letters from prisoners. We put together books for them and send them out. That's a great way to support us. Also, we have people in the organization who are professional booksellers. So they know how to get books cheaply. Rather than send us books, send us money. Donate via PayPal, because we can make those dollars stretch. We can get a lot of books for a little bit of money. So it's generally better for us if people can simply donate to us directly. We'll get the books. It's an all-volunteer organization. Nobody's getting paid here. All the money goes towards the books and the postage. And that's about it, prisonlit.org.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for being with us on Voces Críticas. It's been really wonderful to hear about the work that you're doing with the Prisoners Literature Project.
Silvana, thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me on.